Welcome to Section 3, Part 1. Here I'm going to help you understand European and international policies on adult education. We will also look at adult education in the context of lifelong learning. In the following 3 parts, I will discuss some of the main challenges and give examples of indicators. Even though every national adult education system is unique, I will also try to help you understand some of yours, not so much in detail as in general terms. When you have completed this section, you will have a basic grasp of European and international policies on adult education. You should also be capable of describing the main challenges and some indicators in adult education internationally. Finally, you should understand some things about the adult education policy in your country. As in the previous sections, also this is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, the one you are watching now, explores international adult education policies. Part 2 digs into the many global challenges and indicators in adult education. Part 3 then lands in a national adult education context. You can follow these in the intended order, or you can mix and jump between them as you see fit. And remember, you can always go back to any previous sections or part if you need a refresher or a reminder. Okay? Now, let's go international. After this part, you are able to observe European and international policies in adult education with a critical eye. Adult education policies has been high on the political agenda in the last decades. Well, it may not always feel that way from where you stand, I know, but it is a fact that, for example, several megatrends have increased the focus on adult education internationally. I'm thinking about globalization, digitalization, questions of sustainability. They are examples of things that have all affected the discussion. And that's not all. There is a growing expectation that adult education can be part of a solution, part of an answer. Here, Europe, or more specifically the European Union, has taken a leading role. As a result, many parts of the world now look to Europe for inspiration and guidance. This is not to say Europe is in any way perfect, that Europe is always right, or that the EU is even living up always to its own standards, but we will come back to that. It is always hard to say when something has changed, like, for example, a way of thinking. But if we go back to the year 2000 and Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, we can see that a new way of thinking probably emerged there. Of course, there had been adult education policy in the European Union before that. And so it's fair to say that the Lisbon strategy built on some of that. But we must start somewhere, and Lisbon seems like a good place and time. And in hindsight, we can clearly see that adult education policy in the European Union at the time was in its infancy, that is to say, not very developed. The Lisbon strategy connected the successful transition of countries with knowledge-based economies and societies with the concept of lifelong learning. European education and training systems were growing in scope and responsibilities. With this new connection, both types of systems needed to adapt and were also ready to start doing so. Because the timing was right, the European Commission managed in 2000 to adopt 6 basic messages. They should serve as a roadmap in the creation of developmental programs for adult education and lifelong learning. The so-called Memorandum on Lifelong Learning set out to guarantee universal and continuing access to learning for gaining and renewing the skills needed for sustained participation in the knowledge society. Visibly raise levels of investment in human resources in order to place priority on Europe's most important asset, its people. develop effective teaching and learning methods and contexts for the continuing of lifelong and life-wide learning. Significantly improve the ways in which learning participation and outcomes are understood and appreciated, particularly non-formal and informal learning. Ensure that everyone can easily access good quality information and advice about learning opportunities throughout Europe and throughout their lives. Provide lifelong learning opportunities as close to learners as possible in their own communities and supported through ICT-based facilities whenever appropriate. Let me tell you, recalling this brings back memories. This was a time where we were building things, and we did so with a lot of enthusiasm. Much has happened in the Union and in the world of education since 2000. But still, I think those 6 aims are mostly relevant today. They are also a good example of how to approach the making of a policy. It is ambitious, wide in scope, and yet understandable. At the same time, it is clear that making a promise like this memorandum will keep the policymakers responsible for its delivery. So it is understandable that 5 of these aims are rather general in scope. I mean, a policy that shall significantly improve something? How do we know when that is accomplished? Whenever you read a policy, look for this. How concrete are the aims? What are their indicators? How will it be followed up? How will it be funded? And how holistic is the strategy? That is it very narrow and goal-oriented or wide and general? Then there is the reason behind it all. Did the policymaker think of education as a tool, a means to an end? There are quite many that approach education this way, and there is nothing wrong with that. If the end is adult literacy or employability, who can complain? But you should be careful about the motives. It is one thing to claim something, another to mean it or build for it. Also, a policy that enforces aspects of a society that blocks further development is not built to last. If the policy is top-down or completely expert-run, for example, it has a smaller chance of being successful. If we believe adult education is about empowerment, the policy should support that. This is a tricky and controversial thing, and I will not go further down that road here and now. But please do spend some time with the reading material and make up your own mind. Because I want to take us in another direction now. Policy is also a question of who gets to sit at the table. Over the years, the European Union has slowly improved its methods of inclusion. Today, they often use a method of open coordination. The idea is to support national policies and act as a rule book when designing measures to address common challenges across European Union member states. The European Union is often accused of being a technocratic, top-down institution out of touch with the realities in the member states. The things that the EU can do is limited, and for example education is a national competence, meaning each member state decides over their own education policy and system. So the EU has to be smart and tread lightly. It can encourage, recommend and support. It cannot enforce nor demand. And this situation is, by the way, the same in all international policy making. UNESCO coordinates Confintea, in which education policy is being developed by all UN member states. It is a very arduous and sensitive process where a perceived benefit for some may constitute a perceived risk for others. So in addition, the process is also politicized often, making the whole thing even more sensitive. And I think this is one reason why the inclusion of learning into the Millennium Development Goals and later the Sustainable Development Goals must be seen as a victory, an important step. At the same time, the process of creating, developing or updating a policy is often as important as the end result. Whenever the European Union uses an open consultation process involving all stakeholders, that is to say you and me, or at least the institutions we work for, we get a seat at the table. We are able to influence. And we should not be afraid of this. The policymakers are obviously just like you and me. Yeah, they may have more experience, so it pays to be humble and listen. But in the end, we can accomplish much more by getting involved in the policy-making process. In many parts of Europe, we do not see this anymore as an us versus them approach. Rather, we often want the same thing as the bodies within the EU that deals with education. It is also good to remember, policies and policy work is never completed. Just like we are never fully learned, we can never stop developing and improving policy. I am often frustrated at the two-step forward, one-step backward dance that is policy development, but there is not much we can do about it. I do not suggest we should just accept everything and let someone else do the work. No, I suggest we, as adult educators, have our role to play. For one thing, we need to keep the discussion grounded in everyday life. When your perspective is the whole European Union, or as with UNESCO, the whole world, it is easy to get blind to the details. It is easy to forget who this is for, the learner. When the wording gets too fluffy or abstract and professional jargon creeps into the texts, it is time to sound the alarm bells and ask for a review. We do not want our learners to be passive recipients of our knowledge or wisdom, and neither should we be passive recipients of policy. We need to engage in it. I'm not saying we should all become policymakers or experts. That doesn't make sense. We need educators as well, obviously. But we should be involved, ask the tough questions, try and help improve the policy. Talking of improvement, if you remember the example I gave earlier here about the memorandum from 2000, when we compare that to the Europe 2020 strategy, we see a clear line of development. The importance attributed by the EU to adult education and lifelong learning is clear in this strategy, with its 4 common goals countries in Europe need to tackle and achieve by 2020. Make lifelong learning and mobility a reality. Improve the quality and efficiency of education and training. Promote equality, social cohesion and active citizenship. Enhance creativity and innovation, including entrepreneurship, at all levels of education and training. When you're watching this, we are now beyond 2020, and the Europe 2020 strategy did not manage to fulfill its promises. Is it therefore a failure? Yes and no. It's a failure since the challenges are still there. It is a success as it keeps adult education on the agenda. It shows clearly that there is still an expectation that adult education has a role to play in addressing some serious issues. It maintains the momentum. And so this is another aspect to consider when we assess international policy. It is true this is making our work more difficult and complex. It would be easier if we could simply grade the results with an A for excellent or an F for failure. However, the world is seldom that black and white. There is one thing, though, that you need to be aware of. Back in 1997, at the 5th Confintia held in Hamburg, and yes, I was there, the work began to embrace a larger vision. Let me quote. So, adult education becomes more than merely right. It represents the key to the 21st century, a powerful concept for supporting sustainable, environmental, and promotion of democracy, justice, gender equality, as well as scientific, social, and economic development, and creation of a world where conflict is replaced by dialogue and culture of peace rests on justice. Adult education shapes the identity and gives meaning to life. Learning throughout life involves questioning of contents being learned, which is further reflected in factors such as age, gender, ability, language, culture, and economic disparity. It does sound good, doesn't it? Now, behind the scenes, there were a lot of tough discussions and, yes, conflict. Not everyone shares this vision of the role of education. This was evident in 1997, and it was evident in 2009 at Konventia 6. The overarching goal of that Konventia 6 was to harmonize adult learning and education with other international education and development agendas, and with integration of national sector-wide strategies. Delegates wanted to push forward the recognition of adult learning and education as an important element of and factor conducive to lifelong learning, of which literacy is the foundation. To highlight the crucial role of adult learning and education for the realization of current international education and development agendas, EFA, MDG, UNLD, LIFE and DEST. And to renew political momentum and commitment and to develop the tools for implementation in order to move from rhetoric to action. The final document, known as the Belém Framework for Action, contains conference recommendations and indicators for measuring progress towards their realization. Finally, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals earlier. How did education end up there, and with what entry point? UNESCO held a conference in November 2015, one of many. This particular one resulted in the Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 4. This goal shall ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. It is inspired by a humanistic vision of education and development based on human rights and dignity, social justice, inclusion, protection, cultural, linguistic and ethnic diversity, and shared responsibility and accountability. Educational authorities from all over the world reaffirm that education is a public good, a fundamental human right, and a basis for guaranteeing the realization of other rights. It is essential for peace, tolerance, human fulfillment, and sustainable development. They recognize education as key to achieving full employment and poverty eradication. They focus the efforts on access, equity and inclusion, quality and learning outcomes within a lifelong learning approach. Now, that is something I also can stand behind, and I hope you can too. Now that the goal is set and globally agreed, the hard work of making it a reality continues. With the help of the reflection in this part, you are now better equipped to contribute to that effort. This ends part 1. The next part is about global challenges and indicators in adult education.